themselves, the experts with the more expert, they consider themselves to have more expertise than those political people who just come in for serve for 4 years or 6 years.
Matt Lee is with the Associated Press. Thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you.
House is coming into session. Here they are working on continental shelf issues.
The House will be in order. The chair lays before the House a communication from the Speaker.
The Speaker's Rooms, Washington, D.C., June 27, 2013. I hereby appoint the Honorable Ted Poe to act as Speaker pro tempore on this day. Signed, John A. Boehner, Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Pursuant to the order of the House of January 3, 2013, the Chair will now recognize members from lists submitted by the majority and minority leaders for morning hour debate. The Chair will alternate recognition between the parties, with each party being limited to 1 hour, and each member other than the majority and minority leaders and the minority whip limited to 5 minutes each. No event debate will continue beyond 11:50 a.m. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Gutierrez, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday, a short time after the Supreme Court ruled that the Defense of Marriage Act violated the Constitution of the United States, an immigration judge in New York stopped the deportation of a man who was legally married to an American citizen. According to press reports, the bonds of marriage that tied Sean, an American citizen, to Stephen, a native of Colombia, were invisible in the eyes of the law before 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time yesterday. But after the Supreme Court announcement, the bonds of marriage that drew these two individuals together in love and in the sight of God all of a sudden became visible to the United States government. They materialized before our eyes, allowing a spouse of a U.S. citizen to live peacefully in the United States with his spouse as our immigration laws intended. What a difference a day makes. Well, actually, this step towards justice took a great deal longer than a day. I'm proud that the Supreme Court finally caught up to Sean and Stephen. I'm glad that the law of the land finally caught up to the American people, who generally feel that marriage equality, like other forms of equality, is a good thing. I'm glad the Supreme Court caught up to the 21st century, and I'm glad the Supreme Court caught up to me. In fact, what does a 21st century congressman do on such occasions? I tweeted. And what did I tweet? Quote, "I told you so." It was right here on this spot, on July the 11th, 1996, that the House of Representatives passed DOMA. I came to this well and walked up to the distinguished gentleman from Massachusetts, Barney Frank, who controlled the time on the Democratic side, and I asked him if I could speak on the bill. I had a great deal of respect for the gentleman from Massachusetts, and I have a great deal of respect for him today, now that he's happily retired and happily married. But on that particular day, he said to me, "Luis, I have no time for people who are against the bill. Shoo, go away." Who knows? Maybe it was a mild case of profiling. He saw a Latino Catholic from the Midwest and said, he can't be a friend. I assured the gentleman that as a Chicago alderman, as a congressman, you know something, just as a man, I was against discrimination, bigotry, and unfairness wherever and whenever I saw it, and that I had fought hard in Chicago to pass groundbreaking ordinance on the LGBT equality in the 1980s. The gentleman from Massachusetts smiled, welcomed me to the team, and yielded me 3.5 minutes. I went back to check the record to see what I had said on that night. And you know what? The 2013 me agrees wholeheartedly with the 1996 me. I pointed out that the supporters of DOMA were wrapping themselves up in family values, when in fact they were preventing families from being recognized as families. Quote, "I don't know many Americans, regardless of their political party, race, religion, or sexual orientation, who do not believe that family values are vitally important. But I also don't know many Americans who want a couple of hundred politicians in Washington, D.C. to impose their values on everyone else's families." Let me tell you about some very basic values I think we're talking about when we stand up against this bill, I said that night. The values of people who love each other, people who share each other's lives, people who care about their future and the future of those around them, people who want to make a commitment that is legal and official and is important to them. To me, that sounds like family values, end quote. I'm proud to have spoken up. I'm proud to have voted against that bill, and I'm proud to have stood shoulder to shoulder with Barney Frank and other heroes who that day said no, and today say, I told you so. Now we need to take another vital step right away. The immigration judge that stopped Stephen's deportation because of his legal marriage to an American citizen was absolutely right. But we need to make sure our immigration law reflects the post-DOMA reality across the board. If the Obama administration needs to write regulations to make sure our immigration laws match the Constitution of our nation, then they better get to work. We can't afford delay. Same-sex couples form families. Our immigration laws are supposed to honor families. So, Mr. President, please make it clear from your office on down that family unity means all families. We've waited long enough. The highest court in the land help us take another step against discrimination. Now we must make sure that the administration of the law catches up with the letter and the spirit of the law. All families, like Stephen and Sean's, must be recognized as families for the purposes of our immigration law. What a difference a day makes.
Gentleman yields back. Members are reminded to address their remarks to the chair, and the chair recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Fleischman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today I rise to honor my father, Max Fleischman, Jr. My dad passed away on last Saturday. We buried him Monday in the National Cemetery in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And I wanted to talk to America today about a very special man. My dad was born in Astoria, New York on December 29, 1925. He grew up during the Great Depression. His stories were legend. He talked to me about dime movies and penny candy, about radio, about what it was like to grow up in the Great Depression when his father had to take in other families and live with them. This generation was coined later as the greatest generation, and now I know why. He'd have folks come and visit the house. A fellow by the name of Mo Howard and his wife Helen would come by and sing and play the piano. Mo Howard was playing in little shorts with a little-known group then called the Three Stooges. He would have a lady by the name of Gladys Weiss come and visit their home. Her brother, her late brother, was a magician, an escape artist who had been deceased, called Harry Houdini. These stories were tremendous. He talked to me about his first Coca-Cola at the 1939 World's Fair and what it was like to drink that. He was an incredible man. He had one good eye. He stood 5'2", 1/2 inch. He took 7 years to graduate from high school because he quit high school to join World War II. When he showed up to serve in the United States Army, they said, young man, you can go home. You're what we call 4F. You've got one good eye, you've got poor skin, you're short, you can go home. He said, no, I want to serve. I want to serve. And serve he did. They let him serve, and he went to the China-Burma-India theater. He didn't even know a war was going on in that part of the world because his brother was serving in the South Pacific. He had cousins serving in Europe. But he was 18 years old, and he went on a ship and on a plane and on a train and ended up in Burma. Over 2.5 years later, he returned home, and he went and finished high school. My dad was a hard-working man, a company man. He always showed up and gave 100% wherever he worked. But he had a lot of hard work, and he had a lot of hard luck. Sometimes his companies would go out of business that he worked at. He did not have a formal education, and education was something that stood out to him. And the reason I say that is, in honoring him today, I wanted to talk about the importance of education. I was the first person to get to go to college in my family. He married my mother in 1961. I was born in 1962. But tragically, when I was 9 years old, an only child, my mother got cancer and passed away a few years later. She lost that tragic battle. There were times he had no health insurance. There were times he didn't have a job. He'd go all over the country, New York, Philadelphia, Chicago. But one thing he insisted on, he said, my son is going to get an education. That was so important. And I did. He put $20 away a week so that I could have an education. And I got to go to the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. Well, we didn't know that was not going to be the end of the story, because when I finished up at Illinois, he said, "What are you going to do?" He said, "You're bright, you have an education, but what are you going to do?" So he said, "Go to law school." And he helped me through law school and paid for law school too. So he got to see me get a college education and get a law degree. He had a lot of hard luck, but he always worked hard, and he made a great decision. He retired to Chattanooga, Tennessee. And when he retired to Chattanooga, my wife and I started a law firm. And in that law firm, we succeeded as a small business. He saw me scrimp and save and work hard 6 and 7 days a week, and he always said, "Work hard. Make sure your kids get a good education." And he did that. He was a big part in the life of my 3 sons, Chucky, Jamie, and Jeffrey. They're 24, 22, and 16 now, and they honored him this week with me at the National Cemetery. What a man. He loved this country. He served this country. He never forgot the greatest generation who gave so much for this country. And he was a good guy. He was honest to the core. And he got to live to see me elected to this great house. Y'all see, sometimes we get ratings, 6%, 10%, 11%. He loved to watch this house. He really liked it when I got to sit in the chair. He'd call all the relatives. My son is presiding over the house today. But ladies and gentlemen, we have a great country, a wonderful country. He knew that. Only in America could you do something like this, come from last to first. So I just wanted to say today, thank you to my dad, Staff Sergeant Max Fleischman, Jr. You did well. God bless you. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Maryland. Sorry about that, my colleague. Mr. Hoyer for 5 minutes.
I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend.
Without objection.
I know that before I get to my remarks, join all the House in saying thank you to your father and to the greatest generation, who not only fought the terrorists of their time, but came home and built the greatest economy the world has ever seen, and gave us all opportunities of our generation. Now, I'm older than you are, but of our generation. So I thank you for your comments, and I know that your father is extraordinarily proud of you and extraordinarily proud of the remarks you just made, showing how proud you are of him. Mr. Speaker, tomorrow the majority party is set to recess this House for a week, leaving in place the economy-stifling and irrational policy of sequester. We talked about the greatest generation. I fear that this generation is going to be the greediest generation. It's not going to leave our children the great economy that was left to us, but will leave an economy that is limping because of the policies that we pursued and the debt that we have incurred. When sequester took effect 17 weeks ago, it was the culmination of an effort by the extreme wing of the majority party to impose severe and senseless cuts across the federal government without regard for the real consequences to our economy, our national security, and our most vulnerable citizens. Let me review just some of its many consequences. Head Start and Title I. We will lose between 70,000 and 130,000 seats in Head Start for some of the most vulnerable children in America. 10,000 teachers' jobs will be at risk in Title I to teach some of our most vulnerable children. Social Security Administration Furloughs will cause delays in processing retirement and disability claims. Nutrition for vulnerable populations. 4 million fewer Meals on Wheels for our seniors who rely on them for a daily nutritional meal. 125,000 housing vouchers, perhaps more, be eliminated for people who need housing. Unemployment insurance. Emergency unemployment insurance, past 26 weeks, will be cut 11% for people who cannot find a job, in part because there has been no jobs legislation put on this floor since we've been here this year. 2,100 fewer food safety inspections, 18% reduction in making sure that the food we eat is safe and healthy. On top of these, it also erodes our military readiness, with 1/3 of our combat aircraft on the ground, not being flown, not being training, not being done. As the Washington Post columnist David Ignatius pointed out last Friday, sequestration is forcing the military to cut back on training programs vital to our defense readiness. And yet we fiddle while Rome is burning. David Ignatius writes, quote, "The Army is sharply cutting training above the basic squad and platoon level. All but one of the Combat Training Center rotations scheduled for brigades this fiscal year have been canceled. Depot maintenance has been halted for the rest of the fiscal year. The Army will cut 37,000 flying hours from its aviation training." The list goes on, Mr. Speaker. In February, Army Chief of Staff General Ray Odierno told Congress, and I quote, "Should a contingency arise, there may not be enough time to avoid sending forces into harm's way unprepared." On July 12th, Mr. Speaker, civilian defense personnel at the Pax River Naval Air Station, which I represent, are scheduled to begin furloughs as a result of the sequester. Now, that's a personal concern to me. It's a concern to their families. But more broadly than that, it's of concern to the national security of every American citizen. Those folks are among the hundreds of thousands of civilian defense workers in Maryland and across the country who are set to be furloughed next month unless Congress acts. Congress can end these arbitrary and irrational cuts by replacing the sequester in its entirety as part of a big and balanced solution to deficits. Now, we had a deal. It was called the Budget Control Act. OMB now estimates it cut $1.4 trillion. It's not as if we've ignored the deficit. $1.4 trillion. But we didn't get all the way to where the Speaker said we needed to be, and therefore we adopted the sequester, which irrationally cuts across the board the highest priority and the lowest priority. Our ranking member on the Budget Committee, the Democrat, Chris Van Hollen, has tried 7 times to bring to this floor legislation to exactly modify this policy so that we had a rational, national security protecting, vulnerable citizens protecting alternative while saving and getting to the same budget deficit reducing number. The same. However, our Republican colleagues have refused the opportunity to consider that on this floor. We hear a lot about the Speaker saying, let the House work its will. 7 times we have asked this House leadership to give us the opportunity to work our will. The best way to achieve the balanced alternative to sequester and put America's fiscal house in order would be through a bipartisan agreement on a budget. Leader Pelosi is going to name our conferees in just a few minutes. This Saturday will be the 100th day since the House passed its budget, and after we demanded that the Senate pass the budget. Mr. Speaker, but still, 100 days later, no action on this floor by the majority party to go to conference, to sit down and try to come to an agreement. That's what democracy is about, coming to an agreement. This House should not be going into recess without first appointing conferees. 10% of Americans think we're worth anything. I need to talk to them because they're not sure what's going on here, apparently. I believe there is a bipartisan majority of members, I hope that's the case, who will support a balanced approach that restores fiscal discipline and ends this irrational, common-sense-defying sequester. Let this House work its will, Mr. Speaker. It's time to appoint budget conferees. It's time for a balanced alternative to the sequester. As the sequester continues, there is no time to waste, and we ought to stay here and get the job done. Regular order. Regular order. Regular order. I hear it all the time. The problem is we are not following regular order, to the detriment of our country and our citizens. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I want to say nice job to Chuck Fleischmann for his comments on his father. And before my colleague from Maryland leaves, I want to make sure that that he understands that we understand the history of this whole budget process. The nation's $16 trillion in debt. It was the President's proposal to sequester. And it was his vote, along with my vote, that passed the Budget Control Act that enacted sequester. So many of us are not just going to come to the floor and get lectured to on this process of how do you eventually get control of this national debt. And sequester is a tough process. It's a tough pill to take. It's the first time we've ever cut real dollars. And as I tell my colleagues, in the big picture of a $16 trillion debt, it's pocket lint. It's pocket lint. It's such a small percentage of our future obligations, and that's where the debate on entitlement programs has to go. It's Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and the interest payment on our debt that if we don't get control actuarially in the out years, we'll continue to have to cut the discretionary budget, which is damaging to all those things my colleague mentioned. But for him to come down and profess outrage over a proposal that the President presented to this body, and then to press outrage when he voted for the bill, I think is just the height of hypocrisy. That's not what I came down on the floor to talk about, but this gives us some opportunity to respond. But I did want to talk about the recent occurrences in Egypt, and which identifies that persecution. The Middle East is continuing a changing region, and we have citizens protesting the non-democratic governments numerous times calling for change and freedom across the region. In 2012, the world would watch incredible change in Egypt, followed by the election of Mohamed Morsi when he became the president. This country continues to struggle instituting a democratic government. However, the work of the Morsi government is not met without opposition, and attacks on minority groups are still an ongoing issue. In the recent past, Coptic Christians have been persecuted. And recently, on Sunday, June 23rd, Shia Muslims were attacked by a mob of Sunni Muslims in the village of Zawiat Abu Musallam. 4 Shiites died in this attack, and many others were injured. Shiite Muslims make up roughly 2% of the Egyptian population of 80 million people. While President Morsi has condemned these attacks, further steps need to be taken to address the ongoing persecutions of Egypt's religious minorities. Persecution will continue if sentiments toward minorities are not changed. For Egypt to have a successful, lasting democratic government, people of all religions will need to be included. The United States was created on the principle that all people should have the right to practice their religion freely and openly and without fear of persecution. As a Christian and a member of the House of Representatives that is composed of a vast array of members with different beliefs, it is my hope that this country will continue to be an example that Egypt can look to. I urge the Egyptian government and the people to continue to condemn these religious-based attacks and to take positive steps towards religious freedom. I will continue to keep the country of Egypt and the religious minorities in my prayers and ask my colleagues to do the same. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. McGovern, for 5 minutes. Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I rise once again to address the House on the need to end hunger now. This is the 14th time that I've done so this year. Next week, the members of this House will return home to their districts for the 4th of July district work period. There will be parades and fireworks and picnics for all of us. But for too many of our neighbors, there will be no such festivities. They will be too busy working 2 or 3 jobs just to make ends meet. They will be worrying about their children, who during these summer months are too often forced to go without enough nutritious food to eat because school is out of session. Because in our country, Mr. Speaker, in the richest, most powerful nation in the history of the world, the reality is that 50 million of our fellow Americans struggle with hunger. Now, I'm also sure that during the 4th of July activities that many members will be getting quite an earful from the farmers in their district. Those farmers are now facing confusion and uncertainty as they prepare for yet another season without a long-term reauthorization of the Farm Bill. They will wonder why this House of Representatives can't seem to get its act together. I hope that my colleagues will tell them the truth, that the reason the Farm Bill failed in the House last week is because it would have thrown 2 million people off of the SNAP program. It would have caused over 200,000 children to lose access to the free school breakfast and lunch program. It would have made hunger worse in America. It would have forced struggling Americans to jump through all sorts of hoops like drug testing while not requiring the same of wealthy farmers who receive federal subsidies. It would have not only allowed but actually encouraged states to find ways to kick people off of the SNAP program. In short, it would have continued the Republican majority's assault on hard-working, struggling, poor people. And for many of us on our side of the aisle, that price was simply too high. As the columnist E.J. Dionne wrote after the defeat of the bill, and I quote, "This is above all a story about morality. There is something profoundly wrong when a legislative majority is so eager to risk leaving so many Americans hungry. That's what the bill would have done, and why defeating it was a moral imperative," end quote. Mr. Speaker, I want a farm bill. Our farmers deserve a farm bill. I'm honored to represent hundreds of small farmers, and I'm honored to serve on the Agriculture Committee. I know that Chairman Lucas and Ranking Member Peterson worked incredibly hard to thread a very small needle. If the Republican leadership really wants a farm bill, they should do away with these draconian SNAP cuts and bring a bill to the floor that acknowledges the struggles faced by millions of our neighbors. My fear, however, is they will do just the opposite, that they will go even further, make even deeper cuts to food and nutrition programs, make even more Americans hungry, in a vain attempt to convince some of their more right-wing members to support this bill. Indeed, we see that dynamic at work with the Agricultural Appropriations Bill before us this week, a bill that makes drastic cuts to the Women's, Infants, and Children's Program. I would like to urge, Mr. Speaker, that the White House once again I urge the White House once again to take an active leadership role on this. Last week, the administration issued a veto threat against the Farm Bill because of the devastating SNAP cuts that it contained. And I welcomed that threat it was a positive sign. It was a positive sign that the White House understands that throwing 2 million people off a SNAP would be devastating, not just to those individuals, but to our economy as well. But the administration, quite frankly, needs to do more. They need to convene a White House conference on food and nutrition so that we can get everyone in a room, including our farmers, to address the issue of hunger in America. Let's solve this problem. This is a solvable problem, but it needs attention, and we need to have a plan. Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to reflect over the next week about where we should go from here. Do we want to live up to the bipartisan tradition of giants like Bob Dole and George McGovern, who came together and helped create this anti-hunger safety net that we have in this country? Their leadership almost ended hunger in the 1970s in this country. Unfortunately, we have strayed so far away from what they have done that we now find ourselves with 50 million people hungry. Do we want to unite to provide a circle of protection around our most vulnerable neighbors? I hope so, Mr. Speaker. I hope so. I hope that this House of Representatives understands that one of our obligations is to make sure that the needy and that the poor and the most vulnerable are not forgotten, that we don't sit back and allow them to fall through the cracks. We can do this. We can end hunger now. All we need is the political will. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, 3 major developments have occurred within the last 6 weeks that are each disturbing by themselves, but extremely alarming when viewed together. The first was the revelation that for more than 2 years, one of the most powerful and feared agencies of the federal government was used to harass and intimidate individual Americans into silence because of their political beliefs. Evidence has already established that hundreds of conservative groups were subjected to invasive interrogations when they sought to participate in the political process. This pattern of conduct was not limited to applications under Section 501c, but included audits of established conservative groups and individuals as well. This conduct reached the highest levels of the IRS. A similar pattern of abuse has been documented in several other agencies, including the Department of Labor and the Environmental Protection Agency. These facts are undisputed, and their implications are utterly toxic to a free society. The second development was news that the Justice Department had surreptitiously seized the telephone records of some 20 reporters covering Congress for the Associated Press in an obvious attempt to discourage whistleblowers from talking to the press. Fox News reporter James Rosen and his family were stalked by authorities as he tried to get to the bottom of the Benghazi scandal. To obtain the search warrant allowing this, the Attorney General of the United States filed an absolutely spurious claim with the federal court, charging that Rosen had conspired to violate the Espionage Act. That's the same act under which Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed in 1953. The message to reporters asking inconvenient questions of this administration could not possibly have been more powerful or terrifying. And this week, the head of AP reported that their news sources have indeed dried up in response to these naked acts of intimidation. The third development is news that the federal government has swept up the phone and Internet records of millions of Americans in the name of state security, just months after the official in charge categorically denied the existence of this program in sworn testimony to Congress. The practice of the government searching your personal records without having first established reason to believe that you have committed a crime is expressly forbidden by the Fourth Amendment, adopted in direct response to British officials indiscriminately searching homes and records for evidence of contraband. Yet this government has done precisely that on a scale unimaginable in colonial times, this case searching for evidence of terrorism. Well, if I know the websites that you've visited and what phone numbers you've called, I know a very great deal about your political and religious beliefs, your personal relationships, your sexual interests, your mental and physical health, your family finances. And with that information in the hands of officials who already have demonstrated a clear intention and ability to use their power to intimidate political adversaries into silence or to discourage reporters from asking embarrassing questions, our society could very quickly cross a very bright line between freedom and authoritarianism. As if to underscore the point, the administration's spokesman recently told a national television audience that, quote, "the law is irrelevant." He called these matters a distraction. What does that say about a society that once prided itself on being a nation of laws and not of men? All around this Capitol, we are surrounded by the trappings of the Roman Republic. They serve as an inspiration, but they should also serve as a warning. The Roman Republic didn't end because Caesar crossed the Rubicon with his legion. It was because that illegal act was not effectively resisted and led to another usurpation and then another over a period of years. It was the accumulation of many such infringements that brought the inexorable decline of freedom and set the stage for Rome's age of tyrants. That's what Jefferson meant when he said the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. My great fear as we adjourn tomorrow to celebrate the 237th anniversary of American freedom is that sometime between the barbecues and the fireworks, we shrug off these profound developments and go about as if nothing has happened. This summer of 2013 has brought us to a crossroads, and I rise today to urge the House to give these events its full and undivided attention.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from American Samoa, Mr. Falio Mavanga, for 5 minutes.
Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to extend and revise my remarks.
Without objection.
I also ask unanimous consent a copy of the Washington Post article dated yesterday be made part of the record.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, just yesterday on the cover page of the Washington Post newspaper, there was an article written by journalists John Cohen and Rick Mice that, according to a recent poll taken among the sports fans of the Washington, D.C. area, and I quote, "A large majority of area sports fans say the Washington Redskins should not change the team name, even though most supporters of the nickname find the word Redskin is an inappropriate term for Native Americans." Mr. Speaker, not only is the term Redskin inappropriate, but just plain offensive and derogatory towards Native Americans. And I want to share with my colleagues in Congress, and especially the American people, how the word Redskin came about and its history. In 1749, it was a standard procedure among settlers who live in what is now known as Maine and Nova Scotia to kill and scalp as many of the Indians as members of the Mi'kmaq tribe. And the same policy was also implemented in 1755 by settlers who lived in what is now known as the state of Massachusetts, that their object was to kill and scalp members of the Penobscot Indian Nation. Mr. Speaker, the policy was you'll get paid for killing and or scalping Native American Indians. And if you kill an Indian boy, you get paid 50 pounds. And if you get a scalp of an Indian, you also get paid 40 pounds. Now, for any female, Mr. Speaker, female Indian under 12 years old that you killed or scalped, you also get paid 25 pounds. Mr. Speaker, I submit that these scalps were also called Redskins. And I repeat again, Mr. Speaker, this is why this word is so offensive to Native Americans. Now, Mr. Speaker, there's a saying in Indian country, walk in a man's moccasins for 2 weeks before you pass judgment on that person. Mr. Speaker, my point is, what if that scalp belonged to your mother, or to your wife, or to your daughter, or your brother or sister, or to your son or father? Mr. Speaker, it is my sincere hope that our Washington fans and the American public will come to realize why the usage of the word Redskin has brought nothing but a stark reminder of the horrors of how Native Americans have been treated for centuries. Mr. Speaker, I honestly believe in the fairness and decency of the American people. I believe that many of our fellow Americans did not know of the history of the word Redskin. and I sincerely hope many others will come to a better understanding as to why Native Americans feel obviously offended by the use of the word. I hope Mr. Roger Goodell, the Commissioner of the National Football League, and all the NFL club owners will seriously raise this matter with Mr. Dan Snyder to try to change the name of his Washington football franchise. The NFL has a moral responsibility to take corrective action on this matter. It is the right thing to do. Under the mandate of the U.S. Constitution, Mr. Speaker, the U.S. Congress has both a legal and moral responsibility to look after the needs of our Native American nations. It is for this reason that the bill H.R. 1278 was introduced to not allow or to cancel the registration of the word Redskin as a trademark name simply because it is a derogatory term and a racial slur against Native Americans. Mr. Speaker, don't get me wrong. I'm a great supporter and fan of the sport of football. In fact, I played 4 years of football in high school. Many of my relatives played both in college level and in the NFL. The late Junior Seau of the San Diego Chargers, Troy Polamalu of the Pittsburgh Steelers, Jesse Sapolu of the 49ers, just to name a few, and many others. My point, Mr. Speaker, we need to correct this inequity. We need to show a little more respect for members of the Native American community. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Poe, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, the President this week declared he's going to unilaterally stop climate change. That's right, he's going to part the oceans and change the temperature to his liking. How is he going to do this? Well, he's declaring war on fossil fuels again. This week it's coal. Mr. Speaker, coal counts for 37% of our nation's electricity. How does the President plan to make up for that 37%? Well, the ruler really doesn't say. I guess that 37% will just have to do without heat come winter. In his radical climate change manifesto to a room packed full of his environmental lobby, the President issued an edict to the EPA to regulate coal out of existence. Both Congress and the American people have overwhelmingly rejected this policy in the past. Never mind the will of the people. Never mind Congress has said no to these ideas. The President is pandering to the environmental groups, and he wants it his way. So he's just going to issue another one of those, what I believe, unconstitutional executive orders. Mr. Speaker, there are consequences for such rash actions by the President. The White House war on coal will raise the cost of energy for American families, cripple the economy, and destroy hundreds of thousands of jobs of people who work in the energy industry. The war on coal is really a war on the American people. Mr. Speaker, maybe the President is not aware that the coal plant over here on South Capitol Street heats part of the Capitol. Is this his way to silence Congress? Well, who knows. But this is just another day in the administration whose policy is nothing from below the ground, nothing from below the sea. No oil, no coal, no gas, and no jobs. That's the result of this policy. That's why I've introduced the Ensuring Affordable Energy Act. My bill will put an end to this backdoor attempt by this administration to go around Congress and circumvent the will of the people. This bill would prohibit any EPA funds from being used to implement the regulation of greenhouse gases. This has passed in the House, but it has yet to become law. Now let's talk about natural gas. Down the street from the White House is another marble bureaucratic palace they call the Department of Energy. Sitting on their oak desk are dusty folders holding applications to export liquefied natural gas. In 2010, the oil and gas industry contributed almost $500 billion to our economy. And over the last 7 years, the amount of recoverable natural gas in our country has skyrocketed. For the first time in our nation's history, we have more natural gas than we can use here in the United States, even if we tried. America can sell that gas on the global market for billions of dollars, creating thousands of jobs in the process, but we're not doing it for one simple bureaucratic red tape reason, the Department of Energy. In typical Washington-style fashion, we've seen delay by the Department of Energy to approve these permits. Over the last 70 years, this bureaucratic hurdle was hardly noticed as the U.S. was an importer of natural gas, but not so anymore. Technology has changed all of this. There are some 18 export applications sitting over there on those desks and those dusty folders for the DOE to approve. The Department's response? No response. In the last 3 years, the DOE has granted only 2 applications. Meanwhile, countries that want to buy American natural gas are going to our worldwide competitors like China and Russia. Now, isn't that lovely? Understand this, Mr. Speaker, there is already an agency, FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, that is in the pipeline to approve applications such as this. So we have duplication with the DOE and FERC. And so what we have to do is remove the DOE from the process, remove this duplication. Mr. Speaker, we have enough oil, natural gas, and coal in America to make the Middle East turmoil, Middle East politics, and Middle East energy irrelevant if we would just use our own God-given natural resources. Washington bureaucrats sit at their large oak desk sipping on those lattes every day, and they're regulating American energy out of business. It's time to take the padlock off the marble palaces of the EPA and the DOE and remove the bureaucrats from the energy business. Let's use the resources the good Lord has given us to take care of America. And that's just the way it is. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis, for 5 minutes.
Unanimous consent to revise and extend.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The struggle for equality, for justice, for freedom, for democracy is an awesome force. No force, no historical circumstance have done more to shape our nation. But that struggle has always been confronted by an endless series of attempts to block, minimize, sidetrack, undo, and weaken our democracy. Through all these struggles, those most oppressed have repeatedly taken the lead to reinforce our democracy and solidify our nation. We fought a bloody, wrenching civil war to end a nation that was suffocating, half slave and half free. 3 million men fought in that war, and 620,000 died. Though African Americans made up 1% of the population of the North, they made up 10% of the Union Army. In the aftermath, Congress sought to enshrine in the Constitution forever basic democratic rights. In the 14th Amendment, the power to enforce the Bill of Rights, due process, and equal rights. And in the 15th Amendment, voting rights, regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. But a violent terrorist backlash led by the Ku Klux Klan prevented the implementation of our Constitution for 100 years until a new civil rights struggle based on nonviolence, but no less powerful, forced our nation, the courts, and this Congress to recognize those promised constitutional rights. Among the forms of recognition were the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 65. They transformed the political landscape of America. But the truth is that beginning as far back as the Nixon administration, efforts sought to chip away at those rights. Yesterday's Supreme Court decision undermining the enforcement of voting rights is the latest attempt to roll back history. Shall we go forward or shall we go backwards? The rapidly changing demographics of our nation is calling new forces into the struggle for civil and voting rights every day. And our response to yesterday's Supreme Court decision presents a challenge for every member of this Congress. And we have to ask ourselves, which side are you on? For me, the path is clear. We need a federal right to vote enshrined in our Constitution, one clearly, unambiguously, boldly, proudly asserting that we will not tolerate any infringement on our rights as citizens to express the will of the people. Those who seek to dilute voting rights, to place barriers on every citizen's right to participate in this government, will find themselves on the wrong side of history, and in the end will be no more able to stop the movement for equality, for justice, for freedom, for democracy, than they're able to stop the sun from rising in the morning or setting in the evening, or to stop people who've decided that they love each other from expressing it. I thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Regal, for 5 minutes. Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I rise this morning. Before I begin my remarks, I want to just express my appreciation to our colleague, Mr. Fleischman, and my respect for him and the eloquent tribute that he paid his father. Indeed, his father was a member of the greatest generation, and we thank him for his father for his service to our country. Mr. Speaker, I rise this morning to talk about my #1 priority in serving the 2nd District of Virginia in this incredible country that we have the privilege to live in, and that's jobs. It's the #1 focus of our office, and I rise in strong support of House Resolution 2231, Offshore Energy and Jobs Act, that will come before this House either today or tomorrow. That bill includes language that I authored and introduced, and it creates a clear path and opportunity that can really change the lives of hardworking Americans. And I'm awfully proud of what the bill will do, ideally when it's passed through the Senate and made into law by the President, in job creation. But before I share with this House what the bill actually does and what the language does, I want to make clear what it's not. It's not a bill that spends more money. In fact, it's just the opposite. It's a bill that actually creates federal revenue. Here's how it works. Right now there's a moratorium, a full stop on offshore exploration of energy off the coast of Virginia. And what our bill does and what the language does is it breaks through that, and it opens up that tremendous job-creating potential of Virginia's offshore energy. The first benefit of this bill, of course, is jobs. 18,000 jobs are estimated to be created by this bill just in Virginia alone. And, Mr. Speaker, every one of those jobs is a life-changing job. I'm an entrepreneur in what I refer to as a season of public service, and I've had the privilege hundreds and hundreds of times, perhaps thousands, I don't know, of being able to look at an applicant and say these incredible words, "You're hired." And I know the person goes home and says, "I got the job." That's what Americans are looking for, is opportunity, and that's what this bill advances. And as we become more energy independent, what happens is we've reduced our need to have our young men and women around the world protecting our sources of energy. It makes America a safer country. Right now, more money than any one of us would like are going to countries like Venezuela and Saudi Arabia. These countries don't share our values, and we're fueling their economies. We should be fueling our economy. It creates the revenue, Mr. Speaker, that we need. I'm a Republican who talks about the need for more revenue, but we get that by growing our economy. This is the way we can invest in our schools and have better roads, make the investments that we need to make in our infrastructure. And look, it fast-tracks a great renewable, wind. It has tremendous opportunity. Frankly, it's too expensive right now. But we're Americans. We're smart. We can innovate. We can think our way through this and find a way to make wind energy more affordable. You know, in this very body right here, the President came in and he said, "I'm all of the above with respect to energy." Mr. Speaker, that's common ground, and I'm delighted to say it's common ground. Right now, I'm having difficulty reconciling what he said with this full moratorium off the coast of Virginia. And this bill represents common ground. We've got the governor of Virginia. We have our 2 U.S. senators. Interestingly, both Democrats, Senator Kaine and Senator Warner, both support in principle this same objective. In fact, they're introducing similar legislation in the Senate. The General Assembly of Virginia wants to move forward. There is a clear consensus in Virginia that this legislation ought to go forward. Right now, the only thing holding up these jobs, every one of these life-changing jobs, is the administration. We're not asking for a tremendous amount of money. As I mentioned, in fact, we're just asking for the administration to get out of the way. Mr. Speaker, I didn't mention what tremendous local support this bill has. We have the local NAACP is behind the bill. The mayor of Virginia Beach, the largest city in our district, is behind the bill. Hampton Roads Chamber of Commerce, Hampton Roads Planning District Commission, Hampton Roads Global Commerce Council, the Virginia Port Authority. And we can do this, Mr. Speaker, while meeting the deep obligation that we have, the moral obligation, to leave our children with clean air and clean water and clean soil. To those who put one against the other, that it's either jobs or a good environment, I reject that outright. Why? Because we're Americans. It's in our DNA to innovate and to think through these things. We can have a reliable source of energy. We can help right off the coast of Virginia. We can create the local jobs that we need to give our young people opportunity and our veterans that are exiting the military, so many of whom exit the military right there in Hampton Roads. Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of the bill, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Duncan, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I request permission to address the House to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, last week the 1,200-page Farm Bill was defeated. I'm told that the Senate's immigration bill is now 1,922 pages. The previous Speaker of this body, the gentlelady from California, Ms. Pelosi, famously said that we would have to pass the very misnamed Affordable Care Act. We would have to pass it before we could figure out or find out what was in it. The last issue of the Weekly Standard magazine includes an article entitled, "Our Masters, the Bureaucrats." The article says that today there's only one member of Congress for each 5,150 federal bureaucrats, and says that this bureaucracy is, quote, too insulated from the people. This gigantic bureaucracy has produced so many laws, rules, and regulations that they have not even designed a computer that could keep up with all of them, much less a human being. Almost everyone has violated a federal law at some point, especially a tax law. An innocent mistake is not supposed to be criminal, but a zealous prosecutor can make almost anything criminal. A few days ago, a woman who described herself as a progressive or liberal Democrat and thus would favor all these regulations testified in one of my committees and said that, quote, "At the time each rule was created, it made sense, but over time, the accretion or accumulation of rules and regulations ends up costing us money and frustrating the public. Our federal government has grown so big that it is now almost completely out of control, and the people are suffering because of it. Jobs are killed, small businesses go under, and on and on and on." I started this morning by mentioning the Farm Bill, so complicated that cost estimates ranged all the way from $500 billion to $1 trillion. We didn't even know how much it was going to cost. Everyone respects and appreciates farmers. We must help small farmers as much as we can. Small farmers are important for our quality of life and our economy. However, one part of the bill that I want to discuss here briefly this morning is the subsidy for crop insurance. Every other business in this country, small or large, pays 100% of their insurance on their own. And these businesses do not expect or request subsidized federal insurance. Right now, federal taxpayers are paying for 2/3 of farmers' subsidies in federal crop insurance. Most of these subsidies go to the biggest giants in agriculture. These subsidies also primarily benefit a very few multinational insurance companies. The biggest crop insurer is Wells Fargo, and several of these crop insurance
giants are operated by foreign companies based in places like the Bahamas, Japan, and Switzerland. That's who the U.S. taxpayers are subsidizing. I'm not advocating doing away with the entire crop insurance program. However, the excessive amount of this subsidy just last year cost taxpayers $6 billion and was one of several reasons the Farm Bill went down to defeat. Actually, the Farm Bill should more accurately be called the Food Stamp Bill. I think 20% of it dealt with farmers and 80% for food. I'm not advocating doing away with this program completely, but I did offer an amendment to the Farm Bill to eliminate premium subsidies from being paid on any federal crop insurance policy with what is known as the harvest price option. Under the harvest price option, if the price of the covered crop increases between planting and harvest, the farmer's revenue guarantee is recalculated using the higher harvest price. In other words, giving the farmer more money, sometimes significantly more money than he expected when he first planted the crop. As a result, harvest price options can cause a farmer to receive much more revenue than was guaranteed at planting. According to the Congressional Budget Office, my amendment would have saved at least $7.7 billion over the next 10 years, and possibly even more or much more in years with a severe drought such as the $6 billion last year. This amendment was endorsed by the Citizens Against Government Waste, Americans for Tax Reform, the National Taxpayers Union, Heritage Action, Taxpayers for Common Sense, and a slew of other fiscally conservative organizations, as well as the Environmental Working Group. Professor Bruce Babcock, a professor from Iowa State University who helped invent revenue coverage in the mid-1990s, has said, quote, "Crop insurance is not an insurance program, it's a social program." And he says because of how American agriculture works, it's a social program that helps the biggest agribusinesses the most. My amendment even got a tacit endorsement from the Farm Bureau because they realize this subsidy has now become just too lucrative and too excessive. But the agribusiness lobby was afraid of my amendment, and Big Agro kept my amendment from even being presented on the floor because they were almost certain it would pass. Mr. Speaker, we have to make changes in the future, so too much tax money will not go to Cadillac crop insurance programs. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from South